The Galactic Academy of Interstellar Affairs had seen many strange things in its 400-year history. It had welcomed delegates from the crystalline hive minds of Vethra, trained the six-limbed warriors of Das Prime, and once, famously, graduated a sentient gas cloud from Nebula Sector 9. But nothing in the Academy's long and storied memory had prepared it for Mara Ellison. She arrived on the first shuttle of the intake cycle, a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder, her brown hair pulled into a practical knot at the back of her neck. Among the other cadets, towering Gorak soldiers who stood 3 meters tall, the sleek and silver-skinned Liriani diplomats, the four-armed Chelk engineers, Mara looked like something that had wandered in from the wrong building. Instructor Kale Vera noticed her immediately. He was Theron, a species known across 30 star systems for their tactical genius, their cold precision, and their deeply held belief that physical size was a reliable indicator of battlefield worth. Kale stood 2.5 meters of layered muscle and bone plating, his amber eyes scanning the line of new cadets with the calm disinterest of someone who had already categorized everyone before them as either useful or decorative. Mara, he decided in under 3 seconds, was decorative. Human, he said, not unkindly, but without warmth either. Academy orientation includes a physical assessment course. You are aware of this? Yes, sir, Mara said. You understand the course was designed for multi-species endurance benchmarks? Yes, sir. Kale studied her a moment longer, then moved down the line. He had seen human cadets before. They graduated at acceptable rates. They were clever enough in theory, adequate in practice, and occasionally surprising in areas that didn't matter: music, something called cooking, emotional support for distressed crewmates. Useful, in their way. Like a well-made tool that wasn't quite the right shape for the job at hand. He did not expect to think about her again until the first assessment. The Crucible run was the Academy's opening trial. It was not designed to break cadets, it was designed to reveal them. 30 kilometers of terrain across the moon's rocky surface, steep inclines, narrow ravines, thin atmosphere that forced discipline in breathing, and 3 mandatory checkpoints that required problem-solving under fatigue. The Gorak cadets launched forward like boulders rolling downhill. The Liriani paced themselves elegantly, their long legs eating distance. The Chelk used their extra limbs to stabilize on rocky ground with mechanical efficiency. Mara ran. She was not the fastest out of the gate, not even close. By the 5th kilometer, she was somewhere in the middle of the pack. By the 10th, she had dropped toward the back. Kale, observing from the ridge via long-range scope, made a note in his tablet and moved on to more interesting observations. It was at the 20-kilometer mark that things changed. The Gorak cadet named Hrath, the largest of the intake, a genuine physical specimen, had stopped. Not from injury. From the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from burning too hot too fast. He was crouched on one knee at the lip of a ravine crossing, his massive chest heaving, his legs refusing further instruction. 2 Liriani cadets passed him without comment. The Chelk engineers paused, assessed, determined they could not carry him efficiently, and moved on. It was logical. The run was individual. There were no points for rescue. Then Mara came over the hill. She slowed. Kale watched through the scope, genuinely confused. She slowed. At 20 kilometers into a 30-kilometer run, in thin atmosphere, after hours of effort, she slowed down and moved toward the struggling Gorak. What followed was difficult for Kale to immediately process. The human did not try to carry Hrath, even she appeared to understand the physics of that were unfavorable. Instead, she crouched beside him, spoke something Kale's scope could not lip-read at this distance, and pressed something from her pack into his enormous hand. A small foil packet. Some kind of sustenance supplement, Kale guessed. Then she stood, positioned herself at his side, and, with her comparatively tiny hand, slapped him firmly on the back of one shoulder plate. Hrath looked at her. Even through the scope, the expression on his face was readable. "What are you doing, small thing?" Mara apparently said something else. Hrath stood up. They ran the last 10 kilometers together, Mara matching his pace, occasionally speaking to him. Cale would later learn she had talked continuously. Something about a concept called pacing and a human historical event called the Battle of the Bulge and a person named Sergeant Hank who had carried a man 12 kilometers through snow with a broken rib and never stopped talking. The talking, she had apparently explained, was the point. It kept both of them present. It kept the body from listening to the part of the brain that wanted to quit. They crossed the finish line together. Not first. Not last. Cale looked at his tablet for a long moment and then erased the note he had made about Mara Ellison's projected performance. The weeks that followed were educational, for the instructors as much as the cadets. Mara did not excel at everything. Her scores in heavy-load combat drills were, predictably, unremarkable. She lacked the raw processing speed of the Liriani in tactical theory exams. She could not, despite earnest effort, match the Chelk cadets in mechanical assembly tasks that required 4 hands. But she did something that Cale, in 20 years of instructing, had not quite seen before. She adapted. Not in the superficial way that most species adapted, by finding a niche and staying in it. She adapted constantly, trial by trial, situation by situation, as though failure were simply data she was collecting for a later experiment. She asked more questions than any other cadet. She studied species she would never personally resemble, not to copy them, but to understand why their methods worked, and then find the human-shaped version of the same principle. She also, inexplicably, befriended nearly everyone. Hrath followed her around like a large and devoted geological formation. The Liriani cadet, Savn, who had initially dismissed Mara as non-threatening and therefore irrelevant, was observed eating lunch with her 3 days into the second week and laughing, actually laughing, at something Mara had said. Even the Chelk engineers, notoriously insular, had apparently welcomed her into their study group after she solved a load distribution problem by applying something she called the way my grandfather balanced hay bales. Cale found himself pausing outside the common room one evening, listening to Mara hold court at a table of cadets from 6 different species, explaining something called psychological safety with the earnest conviction of a person who had thought deeply about why groups of people fail when they should succeed. He did not go in. But he listened for longer than he intended. The final exam of the intake cycle was a crisis simulation, a damaged ship, a crew of injured cadets from mixed species, limited resources, and 30 minutes to stabilize before the scenario declared total loss. Every intake cohort ran it. Few passed at full marks. The exercise was designed, explicitly, to be slightly beyond what any individual could manage alone. Mara was assigned team lead. Cale had done this deliberately. He told himself it was because the role rotation system had landed on her name. He did not entirely believe himself. What he observed, over the 30 minutes that followed, would form the core of a lecture he would give every intake class for the next 15 years. Mara did not try to do everything. She did not try to be the strongest, fastest, or most technically skilled person in the room. She already knew she wasn't. Instead, within the first 45 seconds, she had assigned every task to the cadet most suited to it, communicated with a directness and warmth that somehow didn't feel like either command or plea, and positioned herself not at the front of the action but at the center of the communication, the node through which information flowed and from which clarity radiated outward. When Hratha's hands were too large for a delicate repair, Mara talked him through breathing slowly and tried herself, failing, then flagged Savn whose fine motor control was superior. When 2 cadets began to conflict over resource allocation, she stepped between them and said, with complete calm, "You're both right about different parts of this, here's how we use both." With 4 minutes remaining, the simulation's automated system added an unexpected variable, a secondary hull breach that the scenario's designers had included as an unsolvable complication, intended only to measure how gracefully teams failed. Mara looked at it for exactly 6 seconds. Then she did something none of Cale's previous teams had done. She accepted the loss of the secondary compartment immediately, redirected every resource toward ensuring the primary crew survived, and communicated the decision to her team in 11 words. We can't save everything. So we save everyone. Move. They passed. Full marks. First full marks score in 7 intake cycles. After the simulation, Kale found Mara in the corridor outside the assessment room, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, apparently decompressing in the quiet way he had noticed humans sometimes needed. He stood beside her for a moment. Ellison, he said. She opened one eye. Instructor Vera. Your methods are unorthodox. Humans usually are, sir. Kale was quiet for a moment. Outside the wide viewport at the end of the corridor, the stars moved in their ancient, indifferent patterns. He had spent 20 years measuring cadets against standards built for species that were larger, faster, stronger, older in the galaxy. He was beginning to suspect the standards had been missing something. Where did you learn to lead like that? He asked. Mara thought about it. Nowhere special, she said. Humans have just had a lot of practice at being the smallest thing in a dangerous situation and needing everyone else to survive it anyway. She paused. We got good at it. Kale looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised them both. He nodded, not the short, dismissive acknowledgement he gave most cadets, but the slow, deliberate nod of a Theran warrior offering genuine respect. Yes, he said quietly. I believe you did. Somewhere in the galaxy, in 100 different academies and outposts and frontier stations, other species were still making the same mistake Kale had made on that first morning, looking at the small, soft, oddly cheerful creatures from the third planet of an unremarkable star system and seeing something fragile. They would learn. They always did.